I experienced adventure for the first time in a while. Because, for context, I've been playing PalWorld for over 400 hours in total, and I've been playing since the early days of the beta, because I remember I was playing before they even added the Sakurajima Island to the map. So, as I'm playing the official release of PalWorld, I come across an ominous egg. I had never seen this before in the game. I have seen big mutated eggs before, but never this. And it filled me with such wonderment because despite me playing this game for such a long time, there was still more to discover. And that touched me kind of deeply, honestly. And this is why, as someone who is a child of the 90s and was in the midst of Pokemania when it was a thing and has played basically every mainline generation of Pokemon except for Gen 8 because Sword and Shield is terrible, I have to say that PalWorld is better than Pokemon on a number of levels. Because the funny thing about PalWorld now is that it reminds me so heavily of Pokemon Legends Arceus. And I think that's why there's been so much controversy about PalWorld in general, because I know that Pokepair, the creators of PalWorld, were being sued over game mechanics as they relate to Pokemon, basically capturing a creature out in the field with a ball. But the only Pokemon game that allows you to do that in a dynamic fashion is Pokemon Legends Arceus. So I find it very funny that PalWorld, at least to me, is like Pokemon Legends Arceus and more. And what's so funny about Arceus is that I had never seen anyone play a Pokemon game en masse on stream than when Pokemon Legends Arceus was new. People went crazy over that game because technically to me, it's the best one. It's the most active one, and it's the only Pokemon game with a decent battle system that's not broken. Because if you didn't know, if you ask me, the traditional battle system in the mainline games, even after Gen 8 going into Gen 9 now, is broken because Arceus is the only game in which freeze and sleep aren't just instant win buttons. They actually play critical roles in the combat. Freeze acts like burn and weakens special attackers. In the battle system that we know in Pokemon and any other game, special attackers get off sky-free. There's nothing to put them in check. And sleep is called drowsiness in Arceus, and you can actually act within sleep. Therefore, it's not an instant win button just to put your opponent to sleep, as it is in any other mainline game, which is why Arceus still remains the best Pokemon game, in my opinion. Now, what is so funny about all of this is that the reason why, as someone who's been playing Pokemon for 20 plus years, right, I have to say, when I got into the competitive battling scene and the whole bit of breeding your Pokemon and IV breeding them and EV training them and all that, it made me think, even back then, wow, Pokemon's not really a kid's game. People like to think that it is, and like to think like, well, since you like PalWorld, you grew up out of Pokemon and this, that, and the other. And that's not really true, because when you're into Pokemon, it is like a 9-to-5 job. And I think that's not really attractive for anyone who wants to get into the battle system or competitive battling of Pokemon, because it's a very hard sell, because Pokemon's a very unforgiving game overall, unlike PalWorld, because I mentioned something called IVs and EVs earlier. IVs means individual values, in which any Pokemon or Pal has those off the bat when you catch them. And then EVs are effort values, not the Pokemon EV, but the points. They're called effort values, and as your Pokemon defeats other Pokemon, they get these values that correspond to the stat that the enemy Pokemon is best used in, I guess you could say. So, for example, if your Pikachu beats a Gengar, Gengar gives 3 effort value points in special attack. because Gengar is known for special attack, and since he's a fully evolved Pokemon, he gives 3. So in PalWorld, none of that is as hard to come by or is as laborious as it is in Pokemon. Because what's so cool about PalWorld too is that you can unlock an item called the ability glasses that allow you to see the IVs of the PAL before you even capture it, which is a great quality of life item that I wish Pokemon had. And that's basically the gist of this entire video. Anything that was hard in Pokemon is easy in PalWorld. Even when you talk about the whole idea of making your favorite strong, that's kind of a lie in Pokemon. Because even with the addition of items like mints and bottle caps, all of these items are hard to come by. So you can never boost your guy that's maybe a little under par. Your favorite Pokemon, in truth, will never be truly perfect, which is a shame. But in PalWorld, if you give your pal these special fruits that you find out in the world, you can make a loser into a champion pretty quickly. And then, even though the fruits may seem hard to come by, once you start playing the game and seeing different ways of how you can get these fruits, they become fairly easy to run across and to collect en masse. That is why I'm of the opinion that when Pokemon Winds and Waves comes out, which will be the 10th generation of Pokemon, they need to match PalWorld, especially seeing as how they lost to them in court. They need to match PalWorld pretty much beat for beat, bar for bar in quality, because now it's looking kind of suspicious, especially seeing as how Game Freak, the makers of Pokemon, have released a game on their own without Nintendo called Beast of Reincarnation. I have not played it, but I have heard nothing good about it. And that really does highlight that, man, it's not really Nintendo holding Game Freak back. It's Game Freak just being kind of mid, which is a very odd thing to think about, but it makes sense because when you look at every other Nintendo game, Zelda, Mario, even like weird things like ARMS, none of these games are bad. None of these games look bad. Not really. Not even on the Switch 1. Nothing looks bad. So, it's not a Nintendo problem. It's a Game Freak problem. It's a Game Freak problem why Pokemon is so archaic. It's a Game Freak problem as to why Pokemon is so unforgiving. And you see that through PalWorld. Because, for example, when you're EV training a Pokemon in any Pokemon game, it is a laborious task. It is a mind-numbing task because you have to fight the same type of Pokemon over and over and over again in order for those points to get to around 252 in any one stat, right? But you never know how many points you've accrued. You don't know how much you have left to go. And that's kind of not great. But in PalWorld, with the Pal Souls, which are kind of like the EVs of PalWorld, if you go to a statue and you click on your particular Pal, you can know how many souls you need in order to max out attack, defense, or work speed, or HP. And menus help. I don't know what this weird mystical, magical obsession is with hiding information from the player, especially if you want to present yourself as being kind of a technical game underneath the hood, as Pokemon is, to their credit. But you need to give up information. This cryptic way of telling people that they have 31 IVs in any particular stat in Pokemon is a little ridiculous, because in most games you have to go to a random guy in a Pokemon Center and then decipher what his cryptic message means in order to understand whether your Pokemon is good or not. Otherwise, people just use outside calculators to determine the statistics of their Pokemon. And that has never been a good system. Over the many years I've been playing these games, that has always been a bad thing to do because you're not divulging what is actually going on. Now, in later games, they're a bit easier about how they show information, but still, it's not the ease and accessibility that is present in PalWorld. Even boosting your stats artificially with mints is cool, but like I said before, it's always a chore because mints and bottle caps are always hard to come by. And I had said to a friend or two of mine in the past that I wish they just had a way of altering your Pokemon like you do in the online website called Pokemon Showdown, in which you can just battle simulate teams. I wish it was like that, but it never comes to that conclusion. There's always some weird red tape around the mainline games or even Pokemon Champions in which you often find yourself in a way of having to do more work than should realistically be necessary. That is why PalWorld, for all intents and purposes, is better when handling the statistics of the monsters because nothing is hidden. You don't have to figure out what stat your guy is good in. Everything is shown to you pretty much on the table with a very minimal amount of work. So, with all that being said, yeah, PalWorld is doing what Pokemon simply does not. And then on top of that, what is so interesting about PalWorld creatures is that Pals have different abilities that all help you in the game. To Pokemon's credit, over time, abilities that don't work, they have fixed. Like, I remember, for example, there was a Pokemon called Scolipede in the 5th generation, and it had an ability called Quick Feet, which raised its speed if it were burned, poisoned, or asleep. However, in being poison type, it couldn't be poisoned, so you would have to burn it. But the only problem with that is it's a physical attacker, so being burnt doesn't really benefit it a whole lot because it lowers its attack stats. And seeing as how there's no like caveat or workaround for being burnt and being a physical attacker, since Quick Feet doesn't do that, you were kind of stuck. So as time went on, they changed that ability out to Speed Boost, in which it gets a speed buff each turn. And I think that's overall a better ability for that type of Pokemon. But PalWorld has done the same thing because in a similar situation, there is a Scorpion Pal called Pritzker. And beforehand, it only had the ability to guide you out of caves. But that ability seems a little bit useless because caves aren't that big in this game. So they changed the ability out to something way better. In that old ability's place, Pritzker now, while in the party, can increase the player and pal's damage to enemies afflicted with poison by 65%. And this doesn't stack. But that language is very helpful because it lets you know that having more of the same pal in your party will not increase the effect. But also, this effect can be boosted on a singular pal by increasing its rank. And its rank can be increased by condensing multiples of the same pal together in a condensing machine or by giving that pal star fruit. So in every situation, an ability can be made better. And that's pretty interesting because it incentivizes you to catch more of the same pal, which is something that only Arceus did in Pokemon. So I don't know why they went back on this, but since Arceus, they have abandoned this concept. However, it is strong in PalWorld, and I think that's very attractive. On the topic of increasing things, you can increase yourself, the player character, with a variety of different things in the game, because in the world, you will often find these statues of different pals. And if you get multiples of those statues, you can go to the Anubis statue and increase your actual player stats. Now, for the longest time, this only applied to capture rate, which is still a good thing, increasing the chance amount that you have to capture a creature. But since then, they've added a variety of different things, like how long hunger lasts, your swimming ability, how long you can keep food in your inventory without it going to waste, your jumping power, your flight capability, which is a whole different thing in late game, but still useful, your ability to climb, your ability against resisting status conditions, your overall endurance, the amount of tracking your spears have when you throw them out of PAL, the amount of fortune you have in finding good passives on a PAL, which is very similar to like having a shiny charm, I would say, in Pokemon. But you don't have to capture the entire dex for a shiny charm. You just need to go out and adventure and find these particular statues, which is cool. And then lastly, you get statues for catching PALs of the same type, and that rewards you with a statue that gives you more movement speed. So there's always a reward for playing the game. There's always a feedback loop for you to do more, to get more boosts, to get more powerful, and to make the game easier. Which is why I think in a lot of situations, PalWorld does succeed where Pokemon does falter, and that is a shame. So I say again, when Winds and Waves comes out, they need to do something different. There needs to be more interaction with the game as a whole. There needs to be more of a interesting play loop that keeps people coming back. Otherwise, it's going to be more of the same. And if it is, especially for the 10th generation of Pokemon, that's going to be a shame. But with that being said, stay rosy.